All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to talk about one of my favorite topics. Since the release of the book in 2016, I've been doing a lot of talks, writing a lot of op-eds, doing some interviews, just really in earnest trying to get the awareness and impetus out there in terms of just being aware of what's going on and trying to catalyze some change for the West, given all of these global dynamics that are happening out in the world. The West needs to pivot, and I hope through the conversation or the presentation that we have today, you can see some of the why. So I lived in Silicon Valley, California for 15 years, as Nicole mentioned, and I had the privilege of working for a tech multinational. And one of my many roles there, I led a global competitive intelligence and sales support program where I traveled the world to many different countries and heard the challenges, especially from emerging countries, about some of the dynamics that were happening. And this was in the late 2000s. And I also, as part of my job, I also tracked what emerging competitors were doing, namely Huawei and a little bit of ZTE. So these competitors were coming out of China. And then I started to observe that there were different dynamics. It opened my eyes to the evolution of the global world order, the global dynamics. And when I moved back to Canada, a few years ago, I was a little alarmed. I was a little bit shaken because I felt that Canada was still living in a very comfortable bubble, right? We have it really good here in Canada. It's a really terrific place to live. It's made, some of the top lists of the best places to live in the world. And so, of course, we're going to be comfortable and happy. And at the same time, I was concerned and alarmed because I was worried that we were either ignoring what was happening around us outside of Canada with all the global dynamics, or we just weren't really aware. So I hope today that you take away some of the cautions, the alerts, and that we can continue to have Canada to stay, this great place to live. All right, so let's take a look at some of the global trends. What is happening out there? First off, global supply chain challenges. Boy, did we ever feel them during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? It was a huge challenge to get PPE, right? Masks, gloves, robes, just basic materials for the safety of our workers in healthcare, as well as just average citizens. And then, even at a consumer level, how long did it take you to get some of your Amazon purchases, if you received them at all? Furniture shipments, et cetera, stalled big time. And so that just started making us more aware of the hyper-dependency we have on China in terms of the supplies from low-end to high-end goods that they manufacture for us. And then this supply chain challenge was even extended as China implemented their zero COVID policy. Factories slowed down, workers were not producing, and we're still feeling that supply chain pinch. Other dynamics, since we're on the topic of China, China's President Xi got elected for an unprecedented third term. Well, what was the ripple effect of that? The stock market, Chinese companies on the US stock market started to plummet. In fact, there was a loss of up to $1 trillion in one day because of that geopolitical dynamic. Sadly, of course, we all know about the war in Ukraine, right? The war between Russia and Ukraine. It is tragic and very sad at so many levels. But one thing that it's highlighted to us as well is in the light of supply chain dependencies is energy. right? So now we've got countries like Germany saying, oh my gosh, it's going to be a really cold winter because we are so dependent on Russia for our energy. We don't agree with what Russia is doing, but hey, I really can't cut off my people that much. What do I do? Right? What are my other sources? On the US front, lots of activity in the last few years in terms of US. The US standing up to China. And as of late, and it's been extended, is they're cutting China off from very essential semiconductor chips. Why? Well, specifically to Huawei, companies like Huawei and ZTE, they want to stop their growth because they have dubbed, Huawei, ZTE, et cetera, those companies under a Chinese regime that, or government, is potentially a national security threat. And they didn't stop there. They started talking to their allies and saying, hey, don't buy some of this equipment. So there's a squeeze on supply chain from that perspective, and we'll look at how that's a global competitiveness challenge as well. Of course, there's also the green energy thrust and trend, and we've got COP27 that we just finished, or not we, but the meetings just happened globally. It's a big issue. A clean and green tech has to happen. How is it going to happen? Who's going to pay for it? What's the transition plan? Do I really want to give up my traditional oil supplies? I kind of like the price. Why are gas prices going up, et cetera? So there's a lot of turmoil around the hows, despite the whys. And then, of course, let's look at the tech industry. Devastation, metaverse, Twitter, even Amazon. So many Silicon Valley tech companies are laying people off in the thousands. Some, you could say they overhired during COVID, et cetera, but it is still a crumbling effect on the Silicon Valley companies. And then meanwhile, TikTok, right? The Chinese app is hiring still. And in fact, did you know that TikTok in China displays or shows different things than the TikTok that we see here in North America, right? They regulate the amount of viewing time, especially to the youths. And the TikToks are not those fun dancing moves that we like to observe. I don't practice, but some of you try, right? They're not allowed, really. They do TikToks on how to become a doctor. Why do you want to get an education, right? Really nurturing their talent to grow and advance in this new global economy. Just some things to look out for, and there's tons more going on. All right, so then why? Why is this upheaval happening? I hear a lot of comments like, wow, these are really crazy times. Why is this all happening at once? If it's not one thing, it's another. Everything's intersecting. What's happening? Well, let's take a look at some of the reasons at a macro level. So I hope as I went through some of those trends or happenings in the global market, you were observing that there is a geopolitical influence in a lot of these activities or events, right? Geopolitics plays a big role. Now, traditionally, geopolitics, we kind of left that up to the politicians. It really hadn't in the past affected us as strongly in trade, right down to the consumer level as it has been lately. And we'll talk about why in a minute. But quite simply, at a high level, as emerging competitors have become stronger in the global economy, and their influence is stronger, meaning they can affect change, more change that is unusual or untraditional to us in the West. And we talked about some of those changes in terms of supply chains, et cetera. All right, and the Western dependencies on some of these other nations, there's been a risk-reward ratio that we need to reevaluate. We've benefited a lot from some of these disproportionate, say, let's say, lack of diversification in partners, right? We love the fact that we could buy so many things at such a great price. So what if it's like from one country? I mean, how many dollar stores do you need? Now, they've become $1.25 stores and a couple buck stores. I mean, it's gone up a little bit. But we have become a gluttonous consumer society. It's just too easy to replace things, okay? And so we were realizing with the COVID pandemic, and even pre-pandemic, with all of the tension that was happening in the previous American administration, right? The US-China conflicts, it made us aware that, hey, there are bigger implications, and companies like Apple started to even move their manufacturing, or looking at moving their manufacturing away from China and into other countries like Mexico, India, Vietnam, et cetera. And they're still looking. And the whole COVID pandemic crunch has really amplified the impetus to that. But what we have to remember is that this dependency was created over time. And so it's harder to extract so quickly in these times of crisis. Did you know that it would take Apple 8 years just to remove 10% of their production from China? Imagine, just 10%. The ecosystem is so established in China in their manufacturing centers. You have glass, Corning glass, which makes the glass on your iPhones. They moved from the US to China to help supply Apple with the necessary elements in the manufacturing ecosystem so that they could make iPhones, okay? So then there was a trend with decoupling. Oh, I really can't stand, their values are not consistent with our values. I don't want to do business with them anymore. I'm going to make stuff at home. Good, very good. We do need to make more stuff domestically. All Western countries, I think, became loud and clear during the pandemic, need to start making stuff here. But that's hard too. There's a knowledge that needs to happen. There's an ecosystem of supply that needs to be in place, et cetera. So then we thought, okay, well, maybe we start recoupling, finding new partners. Maybe we don't cut ourselves off entirely, okay? Et cetera. So there's been many of such trends, and they do continue. And we did talk about the business and trade impacts. And the one thing that really that the geopolitics demonstrated to us is not everyone is our friend just because we want them to be our friend. And you don't always have to be friends in order to do business, right? Canadians are friendly people. But sometimes that's not enough to make sure that all our security needs are met, right? And then other countries, India's been leapfrogging into becoming a really great service industry. They're fantastic in terms of agriculture and tech. And then the one last thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of Canada and in terms of dependencies is the canola issue. When China decided that they were no longer going to buy Canada's canola, does anyone remember that? It was tragic. It was a devastation. Well, because we had concentrated so much of our sales on China as the customer, and that's, but shouldn't be doing that. We need to have customer diversification as well. We should not be left vulnerable to those kind of leverage points. All right, the next reason is for the upheaval and some of this, the macro level dynamics, is that the global balance of power is shifting. Okay, there's an economic power shift between developed and emerging countries. So for the last few decades, it was all about the G7. The G7 created the rules of engagement. They established this economic order in the world, and these are the rules of engagement. This is how we're going to trade fairly. We have the World Trade Organization as the governing body that's going to make sure everybody plays by nice rules, etc. And one of the goals of the G7 was to enable emerging countries, knowledge transfer, funding, really just help make them grow, help them achieve their socio-economic development goals. It wasn't only the nice thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. And the G7 would also benefit because as these economies became more advanced, that would be additional markets for G7s to sell their goods, et cetera. So it was all good. But what happened was the G7 underestimated the effects of their success on the emerging markets, okay? They also underestimated the ambition and drive of some of these emerging nations. And they failed to see some of their true intentions or their trajectories and plans. No, they didn't want to be manufacturing sources for their, for forever in terms of their economic development. Yeah, manufacturing was a stepping stone for some countries and still is, but that's not where they want to stop. They want to grow too. They want to become wealthy and successful and become innovative like the G7 and other Western countries. But we didn't really calculate this. The West just thought that they could continue to rule forever. And most importantly, I think, the G7 or the West erroneously or naively assumed that these emerging nations would convert to a democratic system, to a democracy, to capitalism as we know it today. So hey, yeah, come on in, come and join our club, and hey, we'll all trade together, we'll all compete together under this one definition or order. But that didn't happen, all right? So as the emerging countries became stronger, they learned from the West, they innovated, they built on the West innovation, and we see that's where Alibaba came from, for example, or Huawei and Xiaomi took the iPhone and the Android platform. They used as the foundations and created their own cell phone variations, and they modified them for local markets. And what happened there was it left an imbalance, right? There was some distress because it was an uneven playing field now because the rules had changed. And then the third macro effect that I wanted to talk about is really the different systems, right? Different geopolitical, different government and political systems mean different values, different priorities, different socioeconomic goals, etc. And so now, since the power has shifted to geos or geographies with different political or government systems, there are new rules that are being introduced. New rules mean the G7 need to adopt a new playbook, right? So the G7 typically are democracies, and they operate by using free markets or a market economy in order to trade, sell, grow. Whereas China, for example, so I'm using USA and China because they are the two superpowers today. China, for example, has a model of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In other words, we're keeping our socialism model. However, we're going to throw in a little bit of the capitalism stuff and maybe make it a hybrid with tighter controls, right? So it's a special blend in their evolution. So they didn't go full capitalism or full democracy. So then, of course, right, when you have these two conflicting systems, what happens? The players show up with different playbooks, different expectations, and then some players get a competitive advantage and others get a competitive disadvantage. hey, that's unethical. You shouldn't have bought those customers with that. Well, I don't know, that's how we play. It's not unethical by our rules, So you can either do what we do or stop complaining, right? Ethics, values, what do you choose? If you are a global multinational, how do you help your emerging countries' sales force compete in those different value systems? There's so many conflicting dynamics happening, and you have to make tough choices. But this, of course, left Western countries a little discombobulated. And we just had those G20 meetings. Well, not we. They had the G20 meetings just a couple of weeks ago. And we saw some of the outputs of that. And we saw who got to say what and make what kind of decisions, who was moving the needle and who was moving it less. All right, so let me use an example in terms of the emergence of 5G technology, another one of my favorite topics. This discomfort with 5G technology really stimulated the US to start saying, whoa. Okay, China's Huawei is #1 in 5G, and not sure this could actually be a national security threat. So they started a campaign telling their peers, hey, watch out, right? If you put this equipment in your networks, it could be a threat. I just want to say for the record, I am not an expert in national security threats. I am not saying that it is a national security threat. I am saying that these are some of the dynamics and issues that have come out from governments with different policies and different systems. All right, so at the end of the day, let's take a look. So the disruption of the West's equilibrium and stability, like we're feeling a little off, aren't we? We being the West. They're like, hey, what's going on? Who's in charge here? And it really is a culmination of these three major macro factors. Geopolitics are playing a bigger role. Poor diversification is helping us feel the impact of that geopolitical power from different nations who are not necessarily congruent with our way of doing things. The power shift, the economic power shift, well, if you can't call the shots anymore, then who's calling the shots, and are you okay with that? And if you're not okay with it, what kind of pivots or changes do you have to make in your approach in order to accommodate some of those choices that you might need to make? And then, of course, the different systems. If different systems, different political and government systems are in place, you're going to have to start making, everyone, is going to have to start making choices about who we do business with, and is the risk, by doing your geopolitical risk assessment, is the risk worth the potential return? And it's not just about China, right? There are other emerging countries. We talked about Russia earlier, and the energy sources, our trend towards, clean energy, et cetera. There are a lot of players in this dynamic. All right, so let's now take a deeper look at the why. So I talked to you about some of the high-level, macro-level dynamics, influences, but let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these issues influencing the change. Innovation. Innovation is a big theme. It's a big word. It's a topic that comes up in a lot of areas, but it's really important in a lot of economies. A lot of economies want to be known as innovators. Why? Because innovation drives global competitiveness, it grows economies, and it makes you a leader. In the past, the West has been kind of the leader or has set the standard in innovation. They said, hey, this is where the market is going. Hey, this is where technology is at. This is where we're moving towards, get on board. Hey, this is even where fashion is going, right? A lot of the developing countries looked, and maybe are still looking to the West to say, hey, what's new? But developing countries have been really smart. They've been watching, learning, and also adopting a lot of the innovations. They've been building on innovations from the West and creating their new versions and new variations. And even, Silicon Valley has been known to be the center of excellence in the world for innovation. People flocked from all over the world to live there, to be in that ecosystem, to help create unique things, to be part of that massive change, that magic that can only happen in Silicon Valley. And I would see droves of Chinese nationals come to learn. In Palo Alto, when I was there at Stanford, and my colleagues would say, yeah, I did another presentation. They asked a lot of great questions. Then I said, how many busloads do we have going over there to learn? Anyway, we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. But let's take a look at this chart. This chart is essentially a summary from the Global Innovation Index of 2022. Is anybody alarmed or maybe dismayed by the fact that China is number 11 and Canada is only number 15? Any hands? I was. Good for China. But what's going on in Canada? Why are we so low? Well, there's a few dimensions. That list, that overview summary score is built on quite a few different dimensions. And the sad part is Canada has been on a steady decline since 2011 for the last decade. We were at number 8. We fell to number 16 last year. And thankfully, we just got a little bump up to 15 this year in 2022. So why? Why is this happening? Well, one of the things that Canada ranked high on in innovation is inputs and investments, okay? However, it ranked super low. In fact, I think number 23rd last year, in innovation outputs relative to its inputs, okay? Outputs are quantified as, basically in 2 buckets. Are you writing scientific and technical articles? And second, are you producing patents? Okay, so Canada scored pretty high on article writing. Really smart. We did the research, we wrote articles. But we've been scoring consistently much lower on patent generation or registering patents. And worse, 50% of those patents, the total number of patents generated by Canadian inventors have been assigned to other world economies. So even if you get a patent, right, we're giving it away. So this is a steady drain of our IP. And that is part of why the number is so low and why we're ranking so low. And of course, right, this severely impacts, some of the dimensions that we talked about earlier: global competitiveness, economic growth, economic security. All right, so naturally, we need to become better at monetizing our research and development, our innovation, our intellect. Right? We're really intelligent. Canadians are very intelligent people, really smart, very analytical. We love to do research. We love to know things. We love to find things out. But that's not a sustainable state of being in this very competitive new global economy. And we lack that sense of urgency. Like, why don't we care? Right? Why aren't the researchers alarmed by these numbers year after year? all right? And this isn't just a Canadian problem, by the way, okay? The UK is also exploring this as well. In fact, they invited me July 2020 to testify in their, the parliamentary session for science and technology. They're trying to, and one of the gentlemen on the panel was, he led an innovation hub, and they were exploring, like, we do all this funding, we've given you billions of dollars in innovation, why don't we have a play in 5G? Amy, how do we catch up? You've been monitoring this, why are we behind? What do we do to catch up? Right? And of course, there's a lot of reasons and defenses. We don't have to, but we have to be intentional about this. We have to look ahead, not behind. All right, so now you might be thinking, okay, well, if 5G is so important and we have all these researchers and yeah, by the way, they're doing a lot of research. The academics are doing a lot of research and moving the needle in 5G, and they are actually, Huawei is purchasing this intellectual property for 6 cents on the dollar. Thank you, Canadian taxpayers, right? All above board, right? Then they're just enjoying the innovation process, and they're not claiming their licenses. So you're saying, hey, well, if we have all of these smart people on board, why don't we have a 5G company? The top 3 players are Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia in 5G equipment worldwide, in this revolutionary technology that has taken the world by storm. US, Canada, UK, nobody has a primary player. Okay, so they're starting to wake up. So then hopefully you are saying, yeah, why don't we, right? Why don't we have a player in this market? Well, one reason, or one aspect of it is that free markets, or capitalism model failed us in this regard. It was, so let me tell you a little bit about free markets. Free markets are essentially, companies get rewarded on a quarterly, short-term basis by the stock market for performance. They look for margins, they look for profit, returns, et cetera. All short-term thinking. But long-term investments, planning, that might not reap short-term rewards don't always pay out. Your stock doesn't get applauded for thinking ahead 5 years down the road. Okay, so market-driven choices don't always win for critical technologies like 5G or national security impacts, et cetera. So I wanted to also talk about then, right? So then back to the topic of why don't we have a company? Well, I almost hate to bring it up, but Canada had Nortel. Yes, Nortel, near and dear to my heart. I worked at Nortel. I think 7 out of 10 people can say that they've worked at Nortel. It was an institution here in Canada. If we had been a little bit more thinking more long range, or if the government had had a little bit of an industrial policy or a long-term strategy in place, they may have or should have bought out Nortel during the demise for a mere, I'd say, $2 to $4 billion. And I say that because somebody told me that that was all that it would take to buy out Nortel. Even if the reason would be simply just to retain the IP here in Canada, the intellectual property. But what happened is we just sold it off. We sold it off to other countries. So we helped them grow. We took a 100-year-plus company, an institution in Canada, the intellectual property, and we just, oh well, say for an average of like, what, $3 billion. That's where the thinking has to happen. Similarly, in the US, why doesn't the US, okay, fine, Canada made a mistake. Why isn't the US capitalizing on this? Well, company, who would have taken it on? Let's say a company like Cisco. Cisco is maybe still the premier networking company in the world. Why didn't they get into radio access networks or the mobile side of business? Well, here's my hypothesis. It's not very lucrative. There's a lot of R&D that goes into radio technology. And it's not so profitable, but it's very strategic, as we see now. But Cisco always took a lot of pride in, hey, I got 65% margins this quarter. And then Wall Street said, very good. We're going to give you a gold star. Again, well done. So they focus on the high margin, short-term investments that give them the short-term rewards. So let me just take a look at, let me just highlight this quote here from Senator Rubio in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, where America was starting to awaken to that potential need for industrial policy to be reinstated, right? That the pure capitalism model perhaps wasn't working so well in this new global economy where different players are using a hybrid system. Capitalism will move money to the most efficient outcomes, and that is generally the right thing. We want that. But from time to time, the most efficient outcome is not in our national interest. We can do industrial policy without abandoning capitalism. He's talking here about why don't we have PPE manufacturing during the height of COVID, right? And it wasn't just PPE, right? There was the pharmaceutical industries. There are critical industries that it was made blatantly aware that we all, Canada, US, UK, needed to have a bigger play. So I want us to keep that in mind as we continue to process some of these dynamics. All right. So you're like, I work in the public sector. Thanks, Amy, for these fun stories, but hey, that's why I'm not in the private sector. It's all messed up. I don't want to deal with that. Why does or should the public sector care, right, about private sector dynamics? Because it is so intertwined now. We cannot separate, right? It can't be public sector, private sector. I'm hoping you're seeing the connection in all of these dynamics. Economic security, economic growth for a nation is stimulated through some of that private sector activity. That means that affects global competitiveness. National security, we just saw it, right? The whole campaign with the US saying 5G equipment from vendor X is a national security threat. What? What does national security even mean? It's just technology. New nuance, isn't it, Ben? Right? This is a new learning. These are new mass awareness points showing us how everything's interrelated. You can't just go out and make something anymore without thinking about where are you getting it? Who's it going to impact? Is this okay? How long will it last? Okay, so I want you to go away with the idea that it is all interrelated, intertwined, and we have to work even more closely together in order to secure the comfort and the security of our country. Back to that bubble that I showed in the beginning. Okay, so let me tell you a little story to just demonstrate how these things happen and how they happen over time. This stuff isn't happening overnight, but you have to watch. You have to be alert, and you have to do a deep dive when you notice a little blip or a trend in what's happening. Okay, so let me walk you through the journey of Huawei's growth journey over the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, Huawei started budding a little bit more as a networking company, and they decided that they wanted to compete in the world of IP networking. And they wanted to become a competitor of Cisco, who was the world leader at the time. And so they became a low-cost equivalent to Cisco, okay? 2003, anybody remember what happened? Anybody old enough to remember what happened? There was a lawsuit, right. There was a lawsuit. Cisco said, whoa, you guys crossed the line. So they sued Huawei for IP infringement and copyright infringement, et cetera. So what happened was, there was a little bit too much lifting. It wasn't just kind of copying a technology in terms of concept, right? There was code, et cetera. So, back and forth, and then Cisco and Huawei settled out of court. But the WTO was involved, right? The World Trade Organization. And that was the stick that Western countries and companies used as emerging countries came on board and wanted to play in the usual G7 economy. Okay, so they settled out of court, but Huawei didn't go away. They were persistent. They wanted to still grow the business. They wanted to become a world leader in networking technologies in the newer world. And so that's where my job came in. Hey, Cisco says, Amy, we're going to give you a job. Can you watch this new competitor named Huawei? They're just not going away. They're showing up in some of our emerging markets customer base, which we haven't paid, we paid some attention to, but boy, they're really digging in there. Can you go do some competitive intelligence? Can you tell us what's happening? Okay, so they continue to grow and swell despite being slapped on the wrist and saying, hey, be nice. So they were a low quality manufacturer, but they were addressing emerging customers' needs in a way that the West was not really doing very well, because short-term thinking versus long-term investment. Emerging markets takes longer to close business on with, right? They need to get to know you. Cultural IQ is really important. Do I trust you? Are you just going to take my money and run Western country and company like others have? But Huawei knew how to counter all that. So they were like, oh, we're your friends. No, we'll help you customize the solution because, this Western company didn't, et cetera. So they built slowly and surely, okay? Fast forward to today. Right? Oh, and then along the way, they continue to invest in mobile wireless technology. Now let me tell you another fun fact. Huawei is not a publicly traded company. You folks are financial people. I hope the wheels are clicking. They are not accountable like publicly traded companies, where the money gets moved around. Who's actually funding some of this research and development? Who's paying for all this? Are they actually buying their customers, which is not allowed? None of that is disclosed, okay? Unfair competitive advantage. Whereas the Western companies had to, and still have to, operate under public company rules. Okay, sidebar. So they grow. Meantime, they continue to learn from the West. Western academic institutions, the best in the world, from the UK to Canada to the USA, are doing research that Huawei is tapping into. And it's fueling them, making them smarter, making them better, making their products excellent products. They have excellent products. And they have pretty good customer service. What a great intersection for any customer that's trying to buy networking equipment and moving the needle. Oh, in this new area called 5G. It's economical and it's really good. So, but I told you earlier, the US and Canada haven't been doing much. US especially, whatever, Margins, margins, margins. American administration wakes up and says, whoa, wait a second, 5G, this thing's important. The world's going nuts about 5G. It's gonna improve economies. It's gonna help with social advancement goals, public safety. This is a rock star technology. Hey, who missed the boat on that? How come we don't have a top 3 position in 5G? And whoa, China? China is not our friend. We're gonna put an end to this. So there's a global competitiveness impetus here. Right? Economic security was being threatened, and that's why today, one of the many reasons why they've, stopped giving Huawei and ZTE access to very essential semiconductor chips. In fact, it really stymied Huawei's mobile phone handset business for quite some time. Now they're in negotiations, right? Europe is saying, come on, America, play a little nice. You know, we all gotta get along. Things are really bad in the whole world. Let's all kind of figure out how we're gonna help each other. Another story. Maybe it'll be our talk next time. But what I'm trying to alert you to is, right, the progress, that journey, and how you know, we just didn't pay enough attention. We just kind of shoot it away at the beginning. And how at the end, it alerted us to our gaps, right? Competitiveness, economic growth, national security, innovation, all those 4 pillars that you see here today, right? The lesson, we have to start paying attention sooner. We're trying to catch up, but the competition is assertive, strong, driven. We can't be as lax as perhaps we have been in the last decade. All right, so what has to happen next? How to compete and grow and win in this new economy? How do we pivot? How do we change so that we can do things differently? Here are some suggestions, all right? We need to work more closely together. There needs to be a tighter public-private sector collaboration going on. And I know, it sounds cliche. It's a cliche term, public-private, you know, sector. But we have to figure out what that means so we can collectively become stronger as a country. I mentioned earlier Industrial Policy 2.0. The 2.0 is really saying, let's make it a more amicable, productive relationship. Industrial policy has had, you know, negative connotations in the past. Oh, the government's telling us what to do. What do they know? I don't want to do what they're telling me. No, let's do this together. Let's explore it together. Let's have kind of like a joint venture together between public and private sector. I mentioned earlier, we got to get smarter about innovation commercialization or innovation monetization. Can we, you know, maybe institute a sister program to all the innovation funding programs where we have a commercialization arm for many, if not all, of the innovation research that's happening? Because those are two different brains. A business brain doesn't necessarily operate like a research brain, and that's okay. Let them create really cool inventions, but let's figure out what it looks like in going to market. In fact, I do a lot of that in my day job. The really smart technical guys created 5G, and then they threw it over the fence to me on the business side and said, hey, go help us make some money so I can go work on 6G next. Like, no, let's get 5G out of the way first, right? Customer diversification. Let's make sure, as funders, as, you know, government lenders to a lot of industries or companies, ensure that they have a wide distribution of customer base, not like the canola instance. Have they done the geopolitical assessment to hedge with that customer base, right? As well as the supply chain diversification angle. So I liken it to kind of like getting a mortgage at the bank. You get a loan, sort of like the, whether it's an the subsidies or the loans we give to the agriculture industry or to the innovation hubs, right? If you go get a mortgage on your home and there's no return on that investment, what happens? What does the bank do? If you don't pay your mortgage after a certain amount of time, they take that asset back. These are assets. Government is investing in assets, and we need to start potentially working or operating like a business. How do we get that accountability for the investments? What is the ROI? If that company or that innovation agent fails, that startup fails, what are we doing with that intellectual property? Open IP. It's, there are great programs. We need to start maybe being more selective about our partners. Who are we sharing our intellectual property with? Is it coming back at us in an unfriendly way? That's where we're at now. It isn't one big happy world where we all want to help each other grow anymore, because there are threats that could come back. And we need to figure out a unified strategy, right? Federal government programs, provincial, municipal. There's a lot of funding happening, a lot of innovation, a lot of research, a lot of trade programs. Boy, did I just get a good view of that when I first moved back here. But maybe if we start coordinating those, we can optimize the returns on those a little bit better. And then we really, as a country, need to develop our 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan. China has a Made in China 2025 plan, and actually now I think it's out to 2050. They've identified the 10 key industries that they want to become excellent at and build their own internal capacity at. And they've been learning, they've been mining all of the intelligence in the world, and they are going to do it at home. They may not need us in a very short order. Okay, we need to figure out what is that plan for us and focus our efforts on that as well. All right, theme of the conference, accelerating from innovation to excellence. I want to encourage us all to be innovative at innovation. We need to change the way we think about innovation. It's not just research, it's not just being really smart and discovering something new and not monetizing it. We have to take it one step further, or a lot of steps further. We need to start getting more curious about new models of innovation, and I talk about this in my courses in the book. Now, business model innovation, China's really good at. Process or supply chain innovation, China's also very good at. Let's start learning from the East as well, not just doing that knowledge transfer or working in the same sandbox. We have to have that impetus, that sense of urgency to also start learning about how do we become better instead of being complacent at our past status of being best. That's what happens, right? When you're known to be the best, you're like, I'm good, I'm on top. But the rest keep rising higher. Being selective, of course, is always important. And IP optimization, what are we doing with it? And if the researcher isn't watching that IP, the value of it, who is? Who's going to help us monetize all this intellect so that we can leap forward, so that next year we're not complaining about being 15 or 14, that we're happy about being number 10 on that global innovation index based on some of these other rules. All right, so the good news is the Canadian government is actually moving in a good direction. They've started to pivot. I've been pleasantly surprised at some of the announcement. We have Minister Joly saying, the Indo-Pacific strategy is coming up really soon. Can't wait to see that. That is about diversification, partner diversification, market diversification. Looking at setting up semiconductor fabs here, fabrication facilities here in Canada. Excellent. It's clearly a geopolitical issue worldwide. It's going to help us not be so dependent on Taiwan, which is, as you know, a very geopolitically tense scenario, because TSMC, the biggest semiconductor fabrication plant in the world, is actually located in Taiwan. Very smart thinking. We're doing investments in clean technology, bringing some of that investments here to Canada, et cetera. Lots going on. And what more can we do? We need to take more action, and we need to move quickly. The analysis paralysis we have no time for. We have to acknowledge that we need to take action. And what kind of action? Well, we just need to be agile about it. You need to look at it in your specific areas of expertise and figure out, how do I pivot? How do I need to pivot? How do I figure out a higher ROI on this asset? We have to develop a cultural IQ, really be aware of our partners, of our customers, and the dynamics that could impact that. And the public sector has some really great levers to use, right? Whether it's regulatory, whether it's, control, economic control, sanctions, et cetera. I'm not saying to start being authoritative or mean about it. I'm just saying the world now operates under what is your leverage, and it's time to pull out some of those tools when necessary to establish that you mean business and the world needs to reciprocate. So let's together make sure Canada continues to be the great place to live that it is, and let's together keep our bubble strong and intact. Thanks for paying attention.
Well, thank you so much. Very interesting subject, and I hope that as public representatives, we're going to have some partnerships to influence some positive change for our country. So I do encourage anyone, if they have questions, to come up to the mic, and for the future sessions, to download that Slido app and use the Slido. So we do have a question that came in. So you can see it. So the question is, in that evolving geopolitical context, how can Canada strike a balance in establishing new ethical partnership with a focus on meeting our environmental targets and objectives?
Yeah, I think it's already happening. Ethical partnerships being who shares our values, who's operating with the same playbook. And we're also seeing China realize we all have to work together in order to accelerate achievements to that end goal. So I would say setting the ground rules, creating kind of like a joint venture statement of work, if you will. And this is how we're going to operate outside of geopolitical influences, and there are penalties if you don't produce as a partner in this goal achievement. That would be my example.